Hi guys, my name is Mr. G and welcome back to American Traditions. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Awakening. And so before we jump into this religious revival movement from the 1700s, we first got to check in on how the colonies have done since the last time we spoke about them. The British mercantilist system was chugging away in the colonies in the early 1700s. So as we know, the British mercantilist system was designed to enrich England. Now this had the side effect of raising the standard of living in the colonies, but that was not its main goal. The main goal was to benefit the mother country, in this case, England. And so we see in the colonies a consumer economy emerge as manufactured goods and luxury goods from all across the British Empire start cycling into the colonies. We see American colonists start to consume many of these goods, right? At least the ones who could afford it. During this period, trade and ties between the mother country and the colonies was probably at its strongest. Now, this would all change after the French and Indian War, or as it was known in Europe, the 7 Years' War. It's also important that we check in on slavery in the colonies. See, by 1750, slavery was legal in all the colonies, but its use varied widely. Whereas slavery was an integral part of southern colonies like the Carolinas and Virginia, it was very sparse in places like New England. See, New England, with a lack of cash crops and a very cold climate, really meant that slavery never really took off in the same way that it took off in the South. Another thing to note is that in the North, there was a lot of hesitation towards slavery, a small but growing movement towards abolitionism. Rebellions in New York State in 1712 and 1741 had really led to a lot of tension around slavery in the northern states. Likewise, groups like the Quakers in Pennsylvania were vehemently opposed to slavery in all its forms. We also start to see a dichotomy forming between European and colonial governments. Whereas European governments at the time were becoming more strict under absolute monarchs, the colonies were very democratic by their standards of the day. There was widespread male suffrage, particularly amongst white males, although some states also had African American males who were free have the right to vote. Colonial governments also had significant power. Now, this would change over time, especially after the 7 Years' War, when the British Crown would try to limit the control that colonial governments had. And so while we're talking about control over colonies, we have to note that it's not a monolith. All these colonies at this point were divided into three different categories. We had provincial colonies like New Hampshire and New York, where the Crown tightly controlled how these colonies were run. These were run directly by the British government. We had proprietary governments, where the governors were appointed by a Lord Proprietor. This was a person with a royal charter. This was someone like a duke or a lord who typically was owed money by the king, and in return, the king would allow them property in the New World as compensation. Right? This is the case of Pennsylvania, probably most famously, where William Penn is granted this colony by the King of England. The last group are the charter colonies. These are self-governing colonies with elected representatives and officials. These are states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which evolved out of groups that settled there, right? We know that Massachusetts famously was settled by the Pilgrims, and that Mayflower Compact was really the first instance of democratic government in the colonies. Family life was also beginning to change in the colonies. Family roles, especially the roles of women, were also changing. In the colonies, women experienced a greater amount of autonomy when compared to their European counterparts. In part, this was due to the less established nature of the Americas. Because institutions weren't always set in stone, that meant sometimes women were required to enter into categories where in Europe they would never have been allowed. Another big change is the idea of marrying for romantic love. Romantic love really takes off during this time. Remember that this is about 100 years after the works of William Shakespeare and other great poets. This idea of romantic love and having the ideal companion, to spend the rest of your life with became a very serious marital goal. Emotional fulfillment became a serious ask in a lot of marriages. Previously, marriages were pretty pragmatic, and sometimes arranged marriages were practiced in the Old World as well as in the colonies. But now, this idea of romantic love was starting to take off. And so, all this being said, this is the time and place where we see a religious revival start to take hold of the Americas. Really, in the early 1700s, there's a series of religious changes that come to the colony. This led to colonists changing in the way that they worshiped and changing how they identified as Christians. And so we see also from this wave of revivalism, there's a criticism and a division between what we call the new lights, these are the new Reformed denominations, versus the old lights, the traditional denominations that still had pretty strong followings. And so we call this period the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening began in the 1730s with revivals in New England, and it soon spread to other colonies. The movement encouraged people to get out there and have individual experiences and question traditional church authority. In fact, all it took was having a Bible and a personal relationship with God. So it's with this fervor and a few key individuals that the Great Awakening really took off in the Americas. The first figure that we're going to look at is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is probably the most famous of the Great Awakening preachers. He's most famous for his sermons like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He emphasized fire and brimstone style teaching and the need for personal salvation and conversion. Right? His works really lent a fervor and a passion to the revivalist movement. He had these vivid depictions of hell and divine wrath and the stakes for people who would not repent. In Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, we see Edward quotes Deuteronomy. This sermon emphasizes the urgency that we have as individuals to seek salvation. He basically states that we don't know when our time will come. We are like people standing on a slippery slope of sinfulness, and that the only thing keeping us from falling into the abyss and falling into the pits of hell is a God who is angry with us if we do not repent, if we do not acknowledge the fact that we are sinners on this slippery slope. And so he says that we must repent in order to be sure that we have salvation and to make sure that God saves us from our slippery slope when our time comes. Another key figure is George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a preacher and an evangelist. He was known for his open-air preaching, and he had a very charismatic style. People really liked going to George Whitefield open-air sermons. He went on this cross-country tour, going across the colonies, helping spread this revivalist message and unite many Christians in this newfound religious fervor. It was almost like a concert series, the way that he would go around and preach to large crowds of people, oftentimes standing on a stage raised above them and spreading the good word. Here we have a painting from the Bolton Museum of Art where we see George Whitefield preaching in Bolton. This is just one example of the crowds that Whitefield would draw in the 1700s. We also get an interesting figure in the Great Awakening. So while he's not an American, he does have a profound effect on the way that Americans would worship. John Wesley was an English cleric, theologian, and the founder of Methodism. Methodism, or the Methodist Church, encourages a disciplined spiritual life that includes prayer, Bible study, and acts of service. And so while he didn't preach his message in the United States, it's around this time during this Great Awakening that we see Methodism really take root in America and spread across the colonies. Methodists emphasize the importance of the sacraments, the need to love one another, and the need to perform acts of service. And so John Wesley is incredibly important to American religious history. And so we see as a result of this, that this revival led to the growth of many evangelical denominations in the United States. I mean, Baptists and Methodists are still among the biggest denominations in the United States today. These denominations, all of them, not just the Baptists and the Methodists, emphasize personal salvation and a direct relationship with God. So if you go to a church today that is Baptist or Methodist or another evangelical church here in the United States, chances are you're going to a church that, at least in part, owes its heritage to the Great Awakening in the 1700s. The Great Awakening had profound effects on the colonies. This movement of revival led to the founding of new colleges and seminaries. Two of the biggest colleges to come out of this movement were Princeton and Brown. And while they're no longer focused solely on religious studies, we do see that these Ivy Leagues came out of this Great Awakening. The Great Awakening also challenged established church authority. After this, many Anglican churches across the United States would shut down and become evangelical churches. One of the more sort of understated effects of the Great Awakening was how it promoted an egalitarian and democratic feel across the United States. This idea that all you needed was a relationship with God and to seek personal salvation led to the individual being part of the core of American life. And so it's out of this that you no longer looked to institutions like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church for guidance. Instead, we see a greater movement towards democratic ideals, and this will help lead the way to the American Revolution. All in all, we can see how the Great Awakening was an important part of American history and led to many dynamic changes throughout what would eventually become the United States. That's all I got for you guys today. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already done so, you can go ahead, hit that little like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're new here, go ahead and make sure you ding that little notification bell so that way you get updates every time I post a video. My name is Mr. G, and I will see you next time.